It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. That's all I know about this Charles Dickens novel, A Tale of Two Cities. A friend of mine recently got me this hat. I'm living in a heat wave in Hawaii, but it could be worse. I could be somewhere else besides Hawaii. So, like I said, I don't know much about this book. We're going to go ahead and start it. Um, all I know is the first line is, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And the title is A Tale of Two Cities. So I'm thinking the author, Charles Dickens, is going to compare one side of life to another side of life. London and Paris, I believe, are the two cities. And I'm assuming that he's going to show the poor side of life and the rich side of life. But let's get started. So the opening says, Charles Dickens was born in a little house in Lamport, Portishead, England, on February 7th, 1812. The second of 8 children, he grew up in a family frequently beset by financial insecurity. At the age of 11, Dickens was taken out of school and sent to work in a London blacking warehouse where his job was to paste labels on bottles for 6 shillings a week. Doesn't sound like very much. His father, John Dickens, was a warm-hearted but imprudent man. When he was condemned to Marsilla prison for unpaid debts, he unwisely agreed that Charles should stay in lodging and continue working while the rest of the family joined him in the jail. This 3-month separation caused Charles much pain. His experiences as a child alone in a huge city, cold, isolated, with barely enough to eat, haunted him for the rest of life. I know the feeling. When I was a little child, I was cold, didn't know family, and didn't have enough to eat. When the family fortunes improved, Charles went back to school, after which he became an office boy, a freelance reporter, and finally an author. With Pickwick Papers, 1836 to 1837, he achieved immediate fame. In a few years, he was easily the most popular and respected writer of his time. It has been estimated that 1 out of every 10 persons in Victorian England was a Dickens reader. Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, and the Old Curiosity Shop were huge successes. Martin Chuzzlewit's was less so, but Dickens followed it with his unforgettable A Christmas Carol. Bleak House, Hard Times, and Little Dorrit revealed his deep concern for injustices of British society. A Tale of Two Cities, 1859, Great Expectations, 1860, and Our Mutual Friend, 1864, complete his major works. Dickens' marriage to Catherine Hopgarth produced 10 children, but ended in separation in 1858. In that year, he began a series of exhausting public readings. His health gradually declined. After putting in a full day's work at home in God's Hill, Kent, on June 8, 1870, Dickens suffered a stroke, and he died the following day. So he lived from 1812 to 1870. That is 58 years. So he died at 58 years old. Preface, the first edition. When I was acting with my children and friends in Mr. Wilkie Collins' drama The Frozen Deep, I first conceived the main idea of the story. A strong desire was upon me then to embody it in my own person, and I traced out in my fancy the state of mind which it would necessitate the presentation to an observant spectator, with particular care and interest. As the idea became familiar to me, it gradually shaped itself into present form. Throughout its execution, it had done complete possession of me. I have so far verified what is done and suffered in these pages, as that I have certainly done and suffered it all myself. Whenever any reference, however slight, is made here in the condition of the French people during the Revolution, it is truly made on the faith of the most trustworthy witnesses. It has been one of the hopes to add something to the popular and picturesque means of understanding that terrible time, though no one can hope to add anything to the philosophy of Mr. Carlyle's wonderful book, Tavistock House, London, November 1859. A Tale of Two Cities, in 3 books. Book the first, Recalled to Life. Chapter 1, The Period. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received, for good or for evil, in the superlative degree of comparison only. There were a king with a large jaw and a queen with a plain face on the throne of England. There were a king with a large jaw and a queen with a fair face on the throne of France. In both countries it was clearer than crystal to the lords of the state preserves of loaves and fishes, that things in general were settled forever. It was the year of our Lord 1775. Spiritual revelations were conceded to England at that favored period, as at this. Mrs. Southcott had recently attained her 25th blessed birthday, of whom a prophetic private in the Life Guards had heralded the sublime appearance by announcing their arrangements were made for the swallowing up of London and Westminster. Even the Cock Lane ghost had been laid only a round dozen of years after rapping out its messages, as the spirits of this very year last past, supernaturally deficient in originality, rapped out theirs. Mere messages in the earthly order events had lately come to the English crown, and people from a congress of British subjects in America, which, strange to relate, have proved more important to the human race than any communication yet received through any of the chickens of the Cock Lane brood. France, less favored on the whole as to matters spiritual than her sister of the shield and trident, rolled with exceeding smoothness down the hill, making paper money and spending it. Under the guidance of her Christian pastors, she entertained herself, besides, with such humane achievements as sentencing a youth to have his hands cut off, his tongue torn out with pincers, and his body buried alive, because he had not kneeled down in the rain to honor to a dirty procession of monks which passed within his view, at a distance of some 50-60 yards. It is likely enough that, rooted in the woods of France and Norway, there were growing trees, when that suffering was put to death, already marked by the woodman, fate, to come down and be sawn into boards, to make a certain movable framework with a sack and a knife in it. Terrible in history, it is likely enough that in the rough outhouses of some tillers of this heavy land adjacent to Paris, there were sheltered from the weather that very day rude carts, bespattered with rustic mire, snuffed out by pigs, and roosted in by poultry, which the farmer Death had already set apart to be the thumbnails of the Revolution. But that woodsman and the farmer, though work unceasingly, worked silently, and no one heard them that they went with muffled tread, the rather forsooth as to entertain any suspicion that they were awake, was to be aesthetically and traitorous. In England there was scarcely an amount of order and protection to justify much national boasting. Daring burglaries by armed men and highway robberies took place in the capital itself every night. Families were publicly cautioned not to go out of town without removing their furniture to upholsterers' warehouses for security. The highwayman in the dark was a city tradesman in the light, and being recognized and challenged by his fellow tradesmen, whom he stopped in the character of the captain, gallantly shot him through the head and rode away. The mail was waylaid by 7 robbers, and the guard shot 3 dead, and then got shot dead himself by the other 4, in consequence of the failure of his ammunition, after which the Mall was robbed in peace. That magnificent potentate, the Lord Mayor of London, was made to stand and deliver on Turnham Green by one highwayman who despoiled the illustrious creature in sight of all his retinue. Prisoners in London gaols fought battles with their turnkeys, and the majesty of the law fired blunderbusses in among them. Loaded with rounds of shot and ball, thieves snipped off diamond crosses from the necks of noble lords at court drawing-rooms. Musketeers went into St. Giles to search for contraband goods, and the mob fired on the musketeers, and the musketeers fired on the mob, and nobody thought any of these occurrences much out of the common way. In the midst of them the hangman, ever busy and ever worse than useless, was in constant requisition, now stringing up long rows of miscellaneous criminals, now hanging a housebreaker on Saturday who had been taken on Tuesday, now burning people in the hand at Newgate by the dozen, and now burning pamphlets at the door of Westminster Hall, today taking the life of an atrocious murderer, and tomorrow of a wretched pilferer who had robbed a farmer's boy of 6 pence. All these things and 1,000 like them came to pass and close upon the dear old year 1775. Envisioned by them, while the woodsman and the farmer worked unheeded, these 2 of the large jaws and the other 2 of the plain and fair faces trod with stir enough and carried their divine right with high hand. Thus did the year 1775 conduct their greatness, in myriads of small creatures, the creatures of this chronicle among the rest, along the roads that lay before them. So that was chapter 1 of A Tale of Two Cities, and thus in the year 1775. So apparently in the beginning chapter it takes place in 1775, and he's describing the King of England and the King of France and all the bad things that are happening. Alright, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button. Thanks for listening.